All right, we're live. Welcome to another episode of the Kink Tank. And for this particular episode, we're going to start with one of our sort of relationship topics, which we call organic rituals, which are different from the factory farmed rituals. These are not that kind of organic. We're talking about rituals and things that develop between people within their power exchange sort of organically or naturally or without any particular necessarily negotiation or explicit um, mindfulness to create this. So let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, I don't want to talk about rituals in general. It's a very large topic in our particular line of conversation. We could go on for hours and hours and hours about it. But I find that some of the cool things that kind of happen between people in a power exchange relationships are accidental or out of habit or just things that people sort of bring personally. Can you think of examples of these, or can you tell me your experience with organic rituals like that?
Well, one of the things that I wanted to say about it was the way that I define these, like you said, is that there are things that you set down and say, we're going to do the following things. And that's totally cool. I do the same thing. There are some things that I have specifically outlined as being things I want to see happen. But the thing for me about those ones that are organic are the things that you don't realize are happening until something happens where they're not there anymore. So I'll give you an example of one of the things that I do is Gypsy, for example, her job doesn't allow her to take her phone to her desk. She has to leave it in her locker. So there are very set times that she can have access to her phone. And without talking about it, she would message me on all of her breaks. Mm-hmm. And so now, if she doesn't message me on her breaks, the next time I hear from her, I ask her if there's something going on. Usually it means that she's been involved in some discussion at work that prevented her from being able to get to her phone. But it's something that develops almost as an expectation once it's been going on long enough, and you miss it when it's gone. You notice its absence.
Right, and then you say, "What's going on? What the fuck?" You
yeah, and it's usually like a sign. For me, it's usually a sign to ask a question. When something is so habitual, especially when it's not discussed, mm-hmm. It becomes very interesting to see what happens when those things aren't there.
And then you might decide to make it a thing. Like,
yeah,
well, I've kind of gotten used to that, so let's make that a thing. Now it's a rule. Now it's a.
I tend to talk about rituals when I talk about service. Personally, my philosophy of service doesn't really separate the two very much. But when I think of what the difference is between them, I usually think of a ritual. I think of a service as being something that I do to make the person that I'm doing service for, to make their life a little easier. When I think of a ritual, it's more about maintaining a certain connection with the person I've agreed to do a ritual for or with. So I think that you can't separate it from power exchange. I think it absolutely has a lot to do with connection and maintaining a certain balance between the two of them. So when I think of organic rituals, I think of rituals that go with natural changes in my behavior anyway, like bedtimes and waking up times, meal times, leaving and coming to places. Like, that's when I think of rituals like that most of the time.
Okay, does anybody have an example? I'm sorry, go ahead.
One thing that we do, and it kind of might be...
I think we're echoing through Josie, maybe?
Yep.
Okay, one of the things we do that we didn't talk about or discuss or negotiate beforehand is before a scene or after a scene, and I've kind of mentioned this in different classes that we've done in the dungeon, that I will kneel before him before and again after our scene. That wasn't something he asked me to do. That was me kind of telling him, I'm ready for you to, like, I'm ready to play with you, and then afterward it is a thank you for this time and thank you for your attention. That was just something that I did on my own. It wasn't ever anything that we negotiated or that he asked me to do. It's just something that we got into the habit of doing, and now it's something that
is expected.
Yeah, if we got done with the scene and I got up and I walked away, probably he'd be pretty upset with me, but it's not something that we negotiated first.
And that definitely falls into the category of things that just kind of happened, and I would notice it if it were gone, and I'd be like, what the fuck? So that again, it just grew very organically, and it's something we've come to just do habitually, and I expect now.
Right, and so it's just something that you sort of brought. It was your personal touch, or just something that kind of felt right at the time. And then he said, "God damn it, I like that. let's do some more of that." And I agree. These are they come from. I think sometimes these organic rituals also come from actual habit. Where you're like, you spend a certain night together, so they come over, and then you're like the old married couple, or maybe you live together and you have a certain time, and they sit there and you sit here, and then it just kind of like happens, and then every now and then there's like a little bit of spice added, a little bit of something, but it comes from repetition. So if you're
I mean, it may seem a minor thing, but I generally don't like to look at it as repetition. I like to look at it as routine. Being the kind of dominant I identify as, I like structure and I like routine, mostly because I tend to be very systematic in the way that I do things. So it's very easy to fall into a routine around me because I tend to be very consistent in the way that I do things, whether it's the times that I do things or the way that I go about things. I'm easy to move around because I'm so predictable in those ways, and so it's easy to form, what you might call rituals around me, because to come up with just an example, and this isn't a real example, but I eat a particular way in a particular place, so it's easy to set out a drink for where I'm going to be when I eat, because I'm going to be in the same place when I'm doing it. What I'm saying is I think it would be a lot more difficult for organic rituals to form around people who are a lot more spontaneous, a lot more
chaotic.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say chaotic, but a lot more unpredictable. Like, say, people that have unpredictable schedules for work. People who come home at different times, or are out on different locations. Those rituals were tougher for me when I was working out of the house, not just because I wasn't here, but because the hours I kept every day were different, and the places I was going were different. So it meant all kinds of different outcomes. So now that I'm here, it's a lot easier to work around, and it's a lot easier for those things to develop sort of organically.
And some of those things, yeah, like you get home from work and so might already be home, or they come and visit you at a certain time or something like that. And then one night you kind of started like, hey, how was your day yesterday? Or how was your weekend? Maybe you haven't had much time. And then you like spend 10 or 15 minutes kind of catching up on what went on. And it turned out like, hey, that was cool. It was a nice little update and whatever. And then it happens again. Then you're like, let's keep that. Let's have a little check-in, a little something when I haven't seen you for X number of, a certain amount of time, because it turned out that, hey, that was cool. Like, we got to catch up a little bit. This is time that we have on a regular basis that we can do that. But yeah, Shane, you're right. If you don't have a routine, it's a little bit harder to do because you have to take that time whenever you get it, rather than at sort of routine times. And then, is it a ritual if it's not as routine? I mean, I guess it could be.
Yeah, I think it is. I just mean it's harder for those things to form sort of as organically. Like I said, routine tends to breed a certain structure inherently, where people find their places in that structure. And so the routine tends to form, and the routine kind of informs ritual, for lack of a better term. If you have somebody who gets up the same day, if your dominant partner wakes up the same day every day, and you wanted to do something nice for them, like putting out their coffee when they wake up, is one of those things that's easy to do without sort of formalizing it, because they're going to be up at the same time.
Right, and just a simple little act like that, where your other person says, God, that was awesome,
Yeah.
Like, let's do that. It wasn't like, I want coffee in the morning, hot and ready for me. It was like it happened, and you said, let's keep that.
Yeah.
And I guess
but I think it's important to recognize a ritual for it to be a ritual.
Yeah, exactly. And that's
the recognizing of the thing is what makes it special to me, instead of just a nice thing that you did for someone.
Right.
Because for me personally, like, I really love a ritual because it is an acknowledgement by two parties to do something and receive something. And the minute it crosses over from that nice thing you used to do into a ritual, that's where my happy feels come from. It was nice before, but it's nicer once we've said that it's a thing.
And that's one of those things for me, is that something that forms organically, like I said, if I notice it, especially in its absence, that's when I do tend to want to formalize it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I've got, I'll speak to that. So Skyline and I have both quit smoking. We are 2 months ago yesterday. So that's very cool for us. Thank you. But we'd been smoking, and a quick, easy one that, again, just kind of formed on its own was when we go anywhere together. I drive. I drive all the time, and she sits in the passenger seat. And hour to hour, day by day, I light my own cigarettes. I smoked 3 packs a day, so it was not practical to have her light all my cigarettes. But while I was driving, she would light my cigarettes for me, and that turned out to be really nice. And like Josie said, we did kind of recognize it. It kind of grew into its own thing. We recognized it, and then added. It was important enough to both of us that we actually added some formality to it, in that I kind of taught her how I wanted her to hold her hands and hand me the lit cigarette once she lit it, so that I could take it without dropping it and burning either one of us. And that was an unforeseen lost ritual that we both missed when we quit smoking. And the first time that we got in the car after we decided we're not going to smoke anymore, it was a little bit like, okay, what now? And almost out of habit, I kind of reached over and kind of grabbed her fingers in the same way, and we had this kind of moment of connective longing, perhaps. Mm-hmm. It was a weird kind of thing, but that was
She could just hand you your vape, I guess, right?
Well, yeah, I can't hold it the same. Like, yeah. Well, yeah, that, and he doesn't put it down.
Yeah, it doesn't leave my hand. In fact, if I don't have 2 of them, something's wrong. Like, I've lost a limb.
But I think that's one of the fun things about these sort of discovered or organic rituals. As Josie says, once you recognize that it's a ritual, like, hey, like, this is a thing now, or I'd like it to be a thing now, you know, then you can expand that. You can say, well, now, whether it's like coffee in the morning or lighting my cigarettes, or just the way that you know, when I put your collar on, I noticed that you knelt in front of me, and I just kind of like that. I like the space that it puts you in. You like the space that it puts you in. So let's kind of make that a thing. But then you can also formalize that, fine-tune it, tweak it, and like after you've recognized it, you can say, if we're going to make this a thing, let's make it a thing. And you can be as specific as you want to, you know, according to your own desires and tastes and stuff. But I imagine a lot of rituals. I mean, Shane, you were saying that you like this topic because a lot of times people are saying, yeah, we don't really do much for rituals. But then as you watch them, there's just a ridiculous amount of ritual that they're not even realizing. And it's unfortunate that they're not recognizing.
And I think that one of the reasons I like a topic like this is because, you know, when I teach my mental play class, one of the things that I talk about is the fact that there's a lot of things that I do consciously that people are doing unconsciously. And when you think about it consciously, it gives you an opportunity to add something to what you've already got going on. Much like Josie was saying, taking something that's happening organically and formalizing it allows you to talk about ways that you are connected, ways that organically you are looking out for each other, right? Because what happens is, you know, from my perspective and from my experience with these organic rituals, is that somebody does something nice for me, and I say, man, that was awesome, thank you. And they feel good because they've been acknowledged for doing this nice thing, so they do it again. Mm-hmm. And the next day I go, man, that was awesome, thank you. And they go, yay, that was great. And it is this sort of self-feeding thing. So when you can take something and say, you know what, you're always doing this for me, I always appreciate it, I would love if you did this all the time. So there's this recognition that goes on that makes the bottom type really happy to be seen for doing something good. You get something out of that for whatever the action is, the ritual is, but it increases your communication, your connectivity by acknowledging those things and addressing them and then being able to manipulate them. much as Brian was saying, okay, it's great that you light my cigarettes. Like, let's make that a thing. Okay, well, now that it's a thing, let's make it a bigger thing. Like, let's actually manipulate it in such a way that we are now being mindful and conscientious while we're doing it. And I just think that those things are very connecting. And the ones that work best are the ones that come up naturally, I find. But people have to recognize them. They have to be aware that these things are going on.
Yeah. And I think another thing that I really like about rituals is they tend to be emotional. Like, they happen in your mind, but they also happen, for me, they make me very present physically. So some of the rituals that I really enjoy, I do light my partner's cigarettes when I'm around him, and I carry the lighter that I use all the time, and I'm constantly filling with it because my hands like having something to do. But there's also a familiarity with that tool that puts me in a certain mindset and that makes me feel comfortable and calm and connected, even when that person's not anywhere near me. Same with I put on and take off my partner's shoes when we come home to the house and before we leave again. And we're talking the whole time. It's not like we're silent and there's a gong playing and it's very, very, it's not like that. We're just shooting the shit. But the point is that I'm doing it, and at a certain point it becomes a muscle memory. And I'm still being very present, but that ritual of doing that, same as putting on and taking off a collar, you drop down to your knees, you're very present in the motion that you do. But I always talk about that, and I write about it a lot when I'm writing, is the some of the most accurate ways that I can ever talk about it is that my knees get lonely or my hands get lonely. I talk a lot about how body parts can have a feeling of loneliness.
I know that feeling.
Talking about, what was that?
I know that feeling. Body parts getting lonely.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that it's important to kind of remember those things, because what I've noticed too is in the absence of a ritual, I tend to have a much bigger reaction to them. So it's not like, some people, if they haven't played in a while, like they start jonesing and they start having that feeling, they can usually recognize what it is. I get the same thing when my rituals are either taken away or because of time or space, there's no room for them. I like a tuck-in at night, like with some of my partners. We do some of that kind of stuff, and there are rituals that are involved with that process. And when they're left out, sometimes I don't sleep as well, or I can't, my head just isn't where I'd like it to be. And I really like that about a ritual, that it brings me present in both of those ways at the same time.
Well, what about people that don't really like routine? We talk about sort of recognizing these organic rituals that kind of spring up, and then tweaking them, seasoning them to your liking or to your interests. There are some people that this might not do anything for. Josie, you're talking about all the good things that it does for you, and some people might feel like, I don't feel that way. I'm just kind of, I don't need ritual. They have no routine. They don't, even like bedtime rituals, how a lot of people are like, well, they get in their pajamas and then they wash their face, brush their teeth, or whatever, and then listen to a podcast while they drift off. That's like a ritual. That's a thing that they do, and it helps center them and tell their body that it's time to sleep and all of that. But some people don't find that as useful. And Shane, you were talking about some of the connectivity of it, that it's a great way to connect. Are people that don't sort of recognize or decide to formalize some of these rituals, are they really missing out on something, or is this something that some people really don't need?
I don't know. From my perspective, I'd say it depends, and I'll answer that so it doesn't seem like I'm just sitting on the fence. I think there are some people that do miss out. There are some people who like routine, who for whatever reason don't get to have it. Like I said, maybe they have a partner whose life and job situation and family situation is just kind of crazy and doesn't allow it. But I think there are some people who are equally happy in a more spontaneous, sort of chaotic environment, simply because it requires attention, right? The one thing that's interesting about rituals and routines for someone like me is it can become very easy, right? Complacent. Like if I do the same thing for 4 consecutive years, you're going to be like, oh, well, it's that time. And you still have that connectivity, but it doesn't have the same kind of mindfulness attached to it because it becomes muscle memory in that sense. So a lot of times people who have partners who are a little bit more, less routine oriented, you really have to be paying attention to them all the time to be able to provide some of those services that you might be interested in doing, because you have to be looking for the breaks to get them in there. Do you know what I mean? And so there's a certain connectivity in being mindful and paying attention to your partner, whereas I will admit, someone like me, you don't necessarily have to mind as much. I'm sort of like a cat where you can leave it for 18 hours because you know it's going to be asleep. You know what I mean? You know, and as long as when I wake up there's a bowl of food there, we're good to go, kind of thing. You know, but everybody has their own style. Everybody has, you know, responds differently to different things. And I think some people do thrive in a situation where they have to be sort of more present because their partner is a little bit more, like I said, spontaneous, or, you know, their lives are a little bit more hectic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes then those rituals in those people's lives is almost even more important. So neither of us are very regimented type people. We're not a Thursday is date night and that's it, and Friday is, you know, we are very spontaneous, and we'll decide each day as it comes or a few days in advance. But having some of those things and adding those, because we're not that way with anything else, makes it even more important. For when we first got together, we were poly, and I kind of had a specific time that I was supposed to be back home, and I was always really good at that. I was always back home when I was supposed to be back home, and then that situation, that relationship dissolved, and we were together one night, and it was past my curfew, and I hadn't thought about it because it wasn't a curfew anymore, and this alarm goes off on his phone, and I don't think anything of it, and he kind of looks at his phone, and he smirks, and he turned it off, and he didn't say anything about it the first couple of times, and then it came to be that every time we were hanging out and it was past this time, this alarm was going off on his phone, and finally he said, "Do you know what that is?" "No, sir." And he said, "Well, that used to be, you know, if that alarm ever went off, that was my time to send you home, and I don't have to send you home. You're here and you're with me. And I don't think I want to turn it off. I think I like that you're here with me, and that's okay, and that you're allowed to be here with me now at this time." So he never turned off that alarm. That alarm went off every single night at the same time, every single night. And then after a few days, it got to the point where it went off, and now I know what this alarm is, and he asked me, "Where are you?" And I looked at him and I said, "Sir, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." And so that became the thing. Like, that alarm, we ended up having to, like you said, sometimes you have to tweak them, sometimes you have to adjust them, and we liked that connection, but it being at 2 in the morning becomes a bit ridiculous when we have lives to live, so we bumped it up to earlier time, and now...
How many times did it wake you up before you said, "Can we turn that fucking thing off"?
Oh, we have never been asleep before 2 o'clock in the morning, ever. I don't think ever.
Zero. So
ever.
The alarm she's talking about is midnight. It happens at midnight.
It's midnight
Oh, okay.
now, yeah.
Gotcha.
And then there is another 2 o'clock bedtime alarm, but no, we are never asleep by 2 o'clock.
Yeah. So we moved it for practicality, but now every night at midnight, and it's gotten to the point where it's so important to us. It's so, like, even if I'm not physically with him, he knows where I'm at. I've told him where I'm going. I've told him who I'm with. He knows where I'm at. And if I'm not with him at midnight when his alarm goes off, he calls me or he texts me, "Where are you?" And I am still exactly where I'm supposed to be. I'm still exactly where I told you I'd be. I'm still exactly where you know I am. I am exactly where I'm supposed to be.
Right. So that's a nice little ritual that sort of occurred because of changes that have happened in your relationship, and kind of by mistake. And you said, you know, let's keep that. That's nice. Cool. Does anybody else have
probably our favorite by far.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Does anybody else have you know, examples of these things that we're talking about? Because I wanted to be kind of clear, you know, I think, Shane, you might have even, or maybe I did, sort of coined the term organic rituals. It's not like a common thing in the community to say, "Oh, well, we have some organic rituals, but then we have some more formal rituals." I just didn't know what else to call it, because I'm talking about a ritual that is not mindfully created, but becomes one of those things. So, I'm just trying to think of examples. And Skyline, that was a really good example of what I'm talking about. Does anybody have any other examples of things that they have in their relationships that came out of mistake or strange circumstances? Jamie, you're smiling like you're not sure if you want to tell us the one.
My favorite thing is very simple. Is every morning, because husband goes to work and I work from home, he makes sure he kisses me before he leaves. Now, on the rare chance that I do leave the house before he does, I kiss him. And it sounds really simple, but when it doesn't happen, it's really annoying.
Yeah.
It kind of messes with your day, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It's like, wait, something didn't happen right.
Yeah.
Is this my OCD or is it just something I really want?
Yeah. You get in the car and you're like, I forgot something. What was it? What am I forgetting? Yeah. And it's not even a thing that you're forgetting.
I think one of the really important points that I would like to bring up, though, especially for people who are new and kind of are wondering about some of this stuff, and Josie alluded to it, and I think Brian and Sky's example is really good. The rituals that work the best, for me anyway, the ones that not only come up a little bit sort of organically, but the ones that really resonate with the people. Like, it's easy to make a rule, and then it's just a rule. It's just something that you're doing because somebody said you were supposed to do it, and now they have to do it, and I have to make sure they do it. And a lot of the ones that we're talking about are these ones that come out of the relationship itself, and then when you identify them, you kind of have this little smile and go, this is what makes us happy together. Like, it's these little things that are why we are doing what we're doing, and they seem very validating, and it's really interesting to participate in those because it's those little moments of just, it's not just like it's a happy moment, it really blows up into explaining why the relationship works well. These are those little things that really tie the whole thing together. So,
yeah, but here's the funny part too. We're talking a lot about power exchange relationships and kink relationships, and these things do exist in vanilla relationships. Now, I have to assume, because of the sort of vanilla relationships I've been in my life, that talking about these things or bringing them up or formalizing them or acknowledging that this is now a thing that I like is probably a little less common than they are in power exchange relationships, but they do happen, and I wonder how many folks in their vanilla relationships realize that they have these things, whether it's the kiss before work or it's a certain TV show that they like watching together, or a certain weekend activity that they always with enough time with a person, and some people would call that monotony, and I guess we should probably clarify the difference. Shane, you were saying you like the word routine rather than repetition.
Uh-huh.
And repetition sort of smacks of monotony. Oh. So what do you do when you're talking about these rituals? And it's kind of the typical thing in a vanilla relationship, like it's the same thing every day, and I do this and she does that, and then we go to bed and then we do it all over again, and it's the bane of a lot of relationships to have maybe too much ritual. Is that what I'm talking about, or are we talking about something other than are rituals different than monotonous habit?
Yes, I think so, and I think the difference is good feels and connectivity. When something starts to feel like a chore, I think it's probably monotonous. But I think if one and hopefully both partners are getting something out of the thing, then it's not a chore. It's something that you do willingly and you look forward to. And yeah, I think a lot of, probably most vanilla couples probably do have some sort of informal, unspoken ritual of kissing each other on the way out the door, or kissing each other when one or the other gets home from work or school or their day. There is ritual there, but in terms of actually getting up and fetching your partner a glass of water, I think that's probably more chore feeling in a vanilla relationship if it happens all the time and it's very one-sided, because there probably isn't the formality of sitting down and having the discussion, hey, you know what, I really like this and this was great and I appreciate you doing this and I'd like you to do this all the time. That feels like something that comes out of the formality of power exchange.
Good. Yeah, but I think that's one of those things about kink and power exchange, and community that I think it's one of the great virtues of it, because you can take something like taking out the trash, which nobody likes to do. Like it's not a fun thing, but when you're thinking of it as a service to your partner, there's this whole world of possibility that's now, wrapped up in this thing that before was so mundane. And when I say, before, that recognizing the thing is what turns it into a ritual, that's exactly what I'm talking about, because it really is all a matter of in your head. And this is one of the reasons why rituals are probably not for everyone, because there is a certain kind of woo-woo quality to ritual, because you're assigning it to this activity. But that's just kind of what I love about kink, and about just kind of this mindfulness that comes with kink, with stuff like that. So when we're talking about, vanilla couples, there is a world of difference between I make the coffee because that's what I do in the morning because I like coffee, and I make the coffee because I love you and that's what I do for you as a service or as a ritual. I think it's the recognition, absolutely.
That's a good point, and I like the coffee example, because a lot of people will make coffee for their partner if they're the first one up, but it's more of a, I woke up first, I want coffee, and I'll just go ahead and pour in some extra water, and fuck it, you can have some coffee too, rather than the very mindful, I'm making coffee, for you, and you're not up yet, and I am going to have a cup for myself. So I think attitude and approach are a good deciding factor there as well.
You're drinking my coffee versus I'm drinking your coffee.
It makes a difference,
Right.
doesn't it? And some of these things too. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about are sort of time-based. They are repetitive. It's the kiss on the cheek, before somebody goes to work, or the check-in when they get home and you guys have some time together. But there are some other rituals that, I mean, I'm not a creature of habit like that. I rarely go to bed at the same time every night. I work weird hours. I don't have a lot of those sort of time-based rituals, but it's one of those things where, like, if we go to the movies, it's kind of a thing. We'll stop at the grocery store and pick up a couple of 20-ounce Cokes and a bag of M&Ms and smuggle them in, and and then a popcorn with some butter, and then we kind of do that. Like, when we go to the movies, that's what we do. But we don't go to the movies a whole lot. But it is kind of nice to have those things too, where, like, it's a ritual when it happens. Or if I'm putting a collar on somebody's neck, that may not be on a regular interval. Some people who live together, it might be, at night it goes on, and then before work it comes off, and then it goes back on. They might have, like, habitual ritual that sort of grows out of that. But when, for people that aren't creatures of habit, you can make it like, okay, but when I put your collar on, which may not necessarily be at this time or even every day, or it might only be when we play. When we play, this is what happens before we play. And some of those things happen organically, like Skyline, you were talking about the kneeling in front of him and stuff. And that makes a gear shift for people if they're, like with the play example, we're about to play. We're changing our attitudes. We're getting into a zone. We're creating space for ourselves. And that's the importance of a lot of people's ritual, and helps anchor them in those moments. But it is important to have those sort of, I don't know, they're not habits, or they're not regular occurring things, but when they happen, that you have some rituals that you recognize around those things.
And that both parties get something out of it. I really like the example of going to the grocery store before the movie. That's not something we do. I'm an idiot, so I pay $40 for popcorn when we go.
Right.
But I can very easily. Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm going to start that. We're new ritual. But I like that, because I like the idea that you can say to your partner, "Hey, we're going to go to the movie," and that person can immediately then start spinning in their brain, "Oh, good, because I like M&Ms."
Mm-hmm.
Like, I like that there can be that association there, where they just know when you're going to the movie, that involves a trip to the store to pick out some candy. There's coolness there.
Yeah. So I don't know. What else do we have on this? I mean, we've been going for about 35 minutes. Have we picked the bone clean, or are there other facets to this that we should be talking about?
Well, you had kind of touched on, and probably I can imagine I am about to piss some people off on this one. The difference between, we do it in the community, in kink and in BDSM and in power exchange. Like, we have these things and we acknowledge these things, and vanilla couples might have those things. I think the bigger difference is in BDSM and in kink and in the community, we have to talk so much. We have to negotiate before we do anything, and we have to negotiate after we do the things, and we discuss all of the things we do so frequently. And I think on the whole, vanilla couples don't do that so much. So if they do have a ritual in the beginning of the relationship, where the guy opens the doors for the female every time she gets in the car, or picks up the bill every time they go out, or buys her flowers once a month because he wants to show her, they start doing these things. But I think vanilla couples don't necessarily discuss those things or the importance of those things in the same way that you get used to and you get in the habit of doing in the community.
And I think one of the byproducts there, what I'm hearing is, it's easier actually for vanilla couples to grow organic rituals, because in a DS relationship you formalize some of those things right away. I sat her down, when we first got started, and said, "You won't touch a fucking door." That didn't have a chance to grow organically. So I think with vanilla couples there probably is a better chance for things to grow more organically. So it's a little bit, I won't call it a wash, but there is some offset there.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Skyline, in general about sort of necessary levels of communication. I think you're giving kinksters far too much credit for doing as much talking as maybe you and Brian do. There are a lot of people who are very mindful about the way they do their relationships, and a lot of them are probably watching this show or are participating on this show, because that's what this show is about. The people that have no interest in these things, finding out about organic rituals and talking through some of these things, there are a lot of them out there, and there are a lot of kinky people who aren't as mindful about these things. And there are some very good vanilla communicators out there too. But I'd say by and large, you probably, the bell curve favors the kinky couples for communication. It's just I don't have any data to back that up. It just feels right. It feels true.
Feels true.
Yeah, and I don't think
That's
it is
science.
It's fox
Yeah,
fruit.
and I don't think it is just like kinky couples, because I'm like one of the guiltiest ones about this with regard to service and rituals, because a year ago, now I have this grasp of it that I feel is really, really strong, and I'm teaching classes on it, and I feel really passionately about the subject. But honestly, this time last year, I remember I sat down with my friend, and she had a DS relationship that was really strongly based in service and ritual, especially because they weren't living in the same city. So a lot of their connection was through that. And I remember sitting down and asking her, like, I don't get it. You get so much out of this. Like, I can see the look on your face when you're doing it, and you just glow with it. And you guys talk about these things, and they're so special. I don't get it. Like, what's the deal? Explain it to me again, because I still, like, I'm seeing it, but it's not connecting for me. And it was so funny, because after we had that conversation a few other times, I was saying, I was kind of sad because I couldn't get service, and I suck at it. And I can't have it in my relationship, and she was actually the first one who said, like, but wait, what? That doesn't make any sense, because she was actually one of the first people that told me, I thought you light his cigarettes, and I was like, oh yeah, but that's not, that's not a service, that's not a ritual, like, that's kind of like playing with your daddy's toys, like, look what I got a thing that grown-ups use, I'm gonna use it. It wasn't really a thing, until she pointed it out to me that it had been a thing for quite some time, and I had just never realized it, and my partner at the time told me the same thing. We both kind of came to the realization at the same time. We were just like, oh, oops, that's totally cool.
That you have been doing service, you just didn't realize it or didn't think of it that way.
Exactly, and the same thing happened, I have a kind of a ritual that kind of developed that was an organic ritual with another one of my partners, where he was always rubbing my feet when I was with him. And it wasn't like Tuesdays at 3 o'clock, this is what we do. It was just whenever we were sharing space, like if we were talking or something, he would like grab my foot and just kind of absentmindedly rub my feet, because I used to work on my feet a lot, and I had some issues with my legs, and it's just always something that he did. And I realized when I would go to his house, his other partner that lived with him would never sit on the couch with us. And at one point I asked her, I was like, why don't you ever sit on the couch with us? And she said, well, I wanted to give you some space because I'm sure he's going to rub your feet later. And so it kind of, even me, like with this love of service and like this trying to understand it, I still didn't see it until somebody else was telling me that I was doing these things. So I don't think it is just vanilla people, but I think that it absolutely, some of the best organic rituals that I have stumbled across have been the ones that other people pointed out to me. So maybe that's kind of just one of those other things about rituals as we're talking about them. Like if you're trying to develop organic rituals, step one, look around at the things that you're doing and see if you're doing one already. Step two for me is absolutely like ask other people. Like if they notice you doing they may notice you doing a thing before you realize you're doing it.
Yeah, because in that case she was like, he's gonna rub your feet. Even I know that, you know, and you were like, oh yeah, well probably, I guess. But they recognized that you had this ritual, I guess, before you did.
Yep.
Great. Well, let us put an end to this one. I thought it was a great conversation. We're going to move on to some of the sort of play topic of the bi-weekly Kink Tank. And this is something that we've kind of been doing this year. We've decided to tackle some play topics as well, which I think is good and sort of versatile for the show and everything. And today we're going to be talking about cutting, needles, blood, and sharp, shiny shit.
Hooray!
So I am going to defer to a lot of, I mean, I have some input here, but I wouldn't say it's like specifically a big thing for me. It's something I dabble in here and there, and I have some opinions here and there. But are there people here on this panel that can tell us a little bit about the kind of play that they do, why they're into it, or if they're on the receiving end or giving end, you know, what they get out of it, I guess. Let's start with that. And that's probably what we should start every play conversation with. Is why would people do this anyway?
Because blood is hot.
Blood is hot.
Well,
yeah.
if we take a bit of a step backwards, one of the things that is really interesting, because I teach a lot of classes on impact play and a variety of other things. And one of the things that I talk about frequently, and I don't think people spend enough time understanding, is that when we talk to bottoms can be very clear about the kinds of things that they like. And as much as it may be cliche or whatever, bottoms understand if they are into stingy or thuddy or more like a sensual play. Like they can be very clear about the kind of language that they use when describing that. And I find that it's a topic that tops are very limited in. Right? So you meet a lot of tops who are like, well, I'm capable technically of doing all of those things, so tell me what you like and I can do it. But one of the things that I've realized is that based on style, I'm a stingy top. And I realize that one of the reasons I like that is because I like the reaction that stingy pain brings. It's more immediate. It feels much more interactive. So when I hit someone with a cane, for example, the kind of reaction I get is much different than the reaction I get when I hit somebody with a flogger. Right?
And that's more satisfying to you.
Huh? Yeah, there's a much more almost like a call and response kind of reaction. That's not a knock on floggers, but you're going for something different. And what I realized is that viscerally my enjoyment of a scene was much more when I was playing with reactions, when I could control the kinds of reactions that I was getting, and I have found that for me, stingy sensations work better for that. So from the early time starting into kink, I started to realize that I had an attraction to canes and single tails and those kinds of things. And so for me, needles and staples and knives are an extension of that same kind of surface, stingy sort of sensation. It is a much more interactive kind of play where there's almost an immediate reaction and ability to even discuss every sensation that's going on as it's going on.
And certainly blood adds to the, you know, the instant gratification, I guess, when, you know, the evidence of it. It's like it might take a few minutes for your cane welt to come up, but, you know, blood can be sometimes very instant.
It's interesting that you would mention that because I think we'll get into that in some of the technical part, but even when it comes to that, there are ways that you can create sensation that is going to create blood, but not immediately, where blood is sort of the payoff for what you're doing. You know, and one of those great examples of that is something like, say, blood cupping, right, where you're going to wind up doing like these different kinds of either small incisions or holes from needles or whatever, but the actual blood is an end result, not kind of what you're going for immediately. And there's a lot of ways to manipulate how you do all those kinds of things. So for me, needle play was a way for me to expand my toolbox for the kinds of sensations and the kinds of reactions I like to get.
Yeah, because there's almost always a or a wince or, you know, something immediate to it, not just like a, you know, I've checked out and you know, there's that call and response that you look for.
Plus, I like to play in some of those marginal spaces. I like to do things that a lot of people don't do. Now, that's not to say that it's a rarity by any stretch, but, you know, when I look at my styles of play, I've always been interested in things that people don't do a lot of, like fire and blood and needles. I mean, there are a lot of people that do it, but when you compare it to something like, say, paddles or floggers, it's a much smaller group. Mm-hmm. And I've always been drawn to those things that have had kind of that interesting, fringy sort of look to it even from a kink perspective.
Okay. Do we have any bottoms perspective that someone like to share about what they get out of it or what they like about it?
I mean, I've been a person who does knife play for about a year now, and I absolutely love like the precision part of it. I'm also addicted to tattoos, but it brings this level of thrill that I get with my partner, because at any moment it could just, you know, be a little too deep. I've been stabbed, I've got scars, but I love the connection and the feel of like the cold steel versus sort of like a hot sort of pain that you get from like electricity or anything like that. But it's more than stingy because it's precision based. It's very sharp, it's very to the point, it knows exactly where it's going versus just stinging all over. So I like the pinpoint precision of knives that you get from that.
So it's a combination for you of the actual sensation of the cutting or the needle, but also there's some fear mixed in there as well.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, you can't do this without fear. That's the fun part.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing about what I get out of it. I started out as a really stingy bottom. The first toy I ever played with was a whip, and then from there it remains my favorite toy, but that's just the family of things that I liked. So to double down on that feeling, I decided to try needles because that would be stingy. But I also really get off on the concept of a person taking things from me or scaring me, marking me, those kinds of edgy sorts of feelings, that type of fear. So when I realized that you could play with these things and have somebody actually take your blood from you, it just seemed like how much further can I go, like in down that hole. So I mean, that's your blood, that's your life. And the only other way that I had, you know, considered playing with that was like through breath and things like that. So it's a similar family for me, different feeling, similar concept. So I like that as a bottom. I like that fear, that particular fear. I think that the sharpness, and I totally agree with Sabina on that point, where it's very precise. You're not all over the place. You have a one concentrated area, and their energy is focused there, and your energy is focused there. And I really appreciate that. As a top, I've gotten more into that lately, and I'm really enjoying being this kind of a needle cutting leading top, because you do get that immediate reaction. I totally agree with Shane, is that even the toughest bottom, who's like a brick house, they're not moving, they're not saying anything. When you stick them with a needle, most of the time there's a movement or there's a breath, there's an intake that kind of go, and they don't yell or anything like that, but you get something from them. You also get a flushing of their skin. You're touching them. You're very close. You don't do needles from far away.
I was going to say, anything, cutting, needles, whatever, is way more tactile. It's way more physically hands-on. You know, like I said, my favorite toy is a single tail. But with my arms and a cracker on a single tail, I am quite legit 6 to 7 feet away from my bottom. And there is a certain ability to be physically touching your bottom that is very connecting. plus allows you to get that same kind of reaction. It's very intimate.
Yep, I totally agree with that. I also think that for me personally, the acuteness of that pain, because it does hurt. I think a lot of people say that like needles don't hurt. They're so tiny. They go in and out. Nope, they hurt for most people. Depending on the parts of your body too, there's a huge difference whether you get a meaty, fatty part of your body or a bonier part of your body. For me, they kind of immediately make me very focused, and they just kind of send me into this really relaxed, very like it would have taken me a lot longer. Like somebody would have had to whip me for a lot longer for me to get to that place, or hit me, or fuck me, or whatever it is. It takes me a lot longer to find that place. With a needle, it's different. It takes two, and then I'm there. Like that.
Let me comment on an observation that I've made in the last, I don't know, couple of years about this type of play. That I don't know if it's because of the marks that it leaves, but there's an aesthetic to this as well. You know, if people are stapling, if people are using needles, it's not just like, well, let's just put a row of needles down here. It's like, no, let's put the needles in, and then let's lace some corset ribbon around it, and then let's make it in a shape, and then let's use different colors, and we'll put feathers on it. It'll be like angel wings coming out your back. You know, there's a certain art, it seems, that's involved with a lot of people's desire to play this way. How much of that is in it for you guys?
It's interesting. For me, the fashion part of it rolls out of the function. And one of the things that's interesting is that when you get into some of the more artistic stuff, the one thing it does is it sets a goal. Anybody who's ever had a tattoo understands this as a concept, right? You get the design laid out, you get that first mark of the needle, and you're like, all right, I'm in for 4 hours of this. Like, there's nothing that you can do about it. And no matter what you do, your brain says, I either tap out and I don't finish, or I suck it up and I finish. So if I tell a bottom, okay, I'm going to do a flower out of needles, their brain is starting to clue into, after the first needle, I'm going to hang out for 35 more needles for this to be done. Like, it allows you to, and that becomes part of the mental game. Like, you're so close, or you're halfway there. Like, you know, you can do this, and it becomes, again, very engaging.
Okay, so some goal setting. And
very rarely have I ever seen people do. That's not true. I've seen a lot of knife play without it, but I've seen very few people do cuttings without a plan. And so you start that cutting, and it's like, okay, you've got one line, and you're like, okay, I think I'm about done. And it's like, no, really, we've got all of this to do. And then you watch them suck it up and go, okay, let's.
Well, there are, and I have had those experiences too, where you get that one line done, and they're like, fuck it, I'm out. This is not, nope. You know, it sounded like a good idea, something they want to try, and maybe we try something, you know, with something small, but that can and will happen.
Right, and obviously that does happen. But I mean, for me, the artistic part of it allows me to create some structure to the scene. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a lot easier to do, you know, conceptually say I'm going to do a design than say I'm going to randomly put in 40 needles.
I totally agree. I like it pretty too. That's kind of half of the reason why I'm in it. I like that there's evidence that it happened. Like, you can beat somebody for a really long time, and maybe the back side of them is red and purple and just kind of inflamed, but it heals and it goes away pretty quickly. I like when I'm sticking needles in someone that I can make a picture and I can do a design, or I can do something, and even when I yank those needles out, there's still evidence that I just did a thing. And I happen to mark for a long time really, really well from things that break my skin. So, like, from a cutting, I like that at the end I get a picture, and I get to keep that picture for a pretty long time. It's not like a welt or a spanking or something like that. Those are also fun. They just don't leave me with a thing that I get to take home with me that's
right.
Pretty.
But what if it was a really bad picture and it really wasn't pretty?
Well, I would punch them in the face.
I'm going to take the opposite approach here. I'm going to be the outlier and say that the reasons I like blood are not necessarily aesthetic. So someone asked me one time, what is your favorite kind of blood play? And my answer was accidental. I really like when blood play is a byproduct of some other type of play we're doing. So if I am hitting someone with a single tail or my hand or a cane or something, and all of a sudden there's blood, hallelujah. That's that's cool. That's fun. Suddenly, it's a cool, fun surprise, and that to me is not like the goal where we've sat down and said, okay, you be still and go away, and I'm going to just slice you up and either in a pattern or randomly. It's we're doing other things, and the blood is a byproduct, and there's a sense of kind of stepping back for a half a breath and taking stock, and oh, we're here now. This is the level to which we're playing, and that's really cool feeling.
Yeah, and so on the bottom side of that, and kind of back to, well, Josie on a couple of points is when she talked about that's your blood, like that is a sacrifice. That is kind of huge. That's not something you just walk around and give to anybody. I mean, to be fluid bonded already, like there's a closeness, there's something there, but to either push myself through a scene and take enough that he has beat me to the point where I'm bleeding, or if we sit down and discuss and I would like for you to cut me and for you to leave this mark on me, and now I have this thing and this mark and this result, and I've done that for him, and there's sacrifice there, and that's kind of huge. That's kind of big. Well, and I love, again, going back to Josie saying that's something you can keep. That's something, and I know we're not really going there, but whether it's a cutting or a branding or a something where now I have his mark, like he has marked me. He has left this on me for anybody to see, and I'm proud of that. Like, I'm proud to wear that mark that he has left me.
And for some people, marks of sort of martyrdom, if they're sort of a martyr bottom. But, you bring up a good point, Skyline, that when you're talking about blood, there's a lot of sacred stigma attached to blood. We sort of rate the sanctity of our bodily fluids. Spit, whatever. I'll swap spit with anybody. That's cool. Tears, not a big deal. You get somebody else's tears on you, it's fine. Whatever.
Yeah, it's hot.
Semen, okay, now we're talking. Now it's like another level. Blood is like taboo for a lot of people. Think of how blood's been used throughout the history of the world. What it signifies, Catholics drink it every week at the altar. It has a lot of cultural significance attached to it, and I think that there are some folks, certainly blood drinkers and people who play that way. There is a sacred aspect to the kind of play that they're doing, and some of us may be into that and some of us may not be, but I don't think that you can ignore, if you play with blood, that there is something special about that red fluid that comes out that you don't get with something else.
It's intimate.
And it's not just like, it's not just like, I mean, there's a huge amount of trust involved with that. It's a sacred thing because it's a thing we don't normally play with or do anything, fun with. But it takes a huge amount of trust, whether that's because you're licking it and we're fluid bonded that way, or just because you're drawing your name in it. It doesn't really matter. I mean, that's hot to trust somebody to that level for me.
If I may for a second and go back to, and I realize it's not usually what we do, but to go back to our other topic on rituals, Megan and I were in California, and we attended a class because we're really into a lot of blood play, but they actually had a blood class taught by a nurse on blood draws. And so they had all of the equipment there for blood draws, and what we were able to do was we were able to each fill vials, and these are set as charms that you can hang, of our blood mixed that we had each drawn out of the other at this class. And they gave us the anticoagulant tubes, and then we drew that out of those and put them in here so it'll never dry. Mm-hmm. But we each have one of these of our combined blood that we travel with. So we literally have a piece of each other whenever we're on the road. Mm-hmm. But what's important about that is that it wasn't just like, a byproduct of a medical exam. This was something that we went in knowing and were able to do, where we each drew the other's blood for these.
Right.
So that kind of gives us another cool thing about blood play, or when you're playing with needles and knives and cutting, you're inevitably playing with blood most of the time. Not everybody will bleed from a needle, but out of 10 of them, you'll likely bleed from one, even if blood wasn't the point. It's a common result. And you don't have to be fluid bonded with somebody to do any of this kind of play, certainly not. But I think it's a lot more fun when you are a lot of the time because you have the opportunity to do that. So if you punch somebody, you're having a power exchange, and that's kind of one level, and it's awesome and it's cool. But you're not blending your fluid that way. It's the same as fucking somebody. It's kind of a big deal. Like you just shared somebody, and I think personally there's a really big difference between having sex with someone that's protected and having sex with someone that's not. It's a really similar kind of feeling, to me at least, with regard to connection, with regard to trust, with regard to like the power exchange inherent in that. That's kind of another thing about this type of play that I really like.
I think, though, that when blood comes into play, and, I play a lot in public spaces, so in Lexington, blood can't flow freely in the club. And it takes a level of trust that when that happens, my partner's going to stay, take care of me and clean me up, make sure that it's not getting dirt in it. It's certainly not a place that I would want to get dirty, and that nobody else kind of gets involved in that doesn't need to be or doesn't want to be.
Right.
So I think it's sort of
blood play in a public dungeon is certainly, rife with gotchas and rules and standards that people have, for sure. And so far, I think we've been talking mostly about private play or, with partners. But you make a good point. When you're in a dungeon space, first you have to find out, can we do this at all? Bleeding on purpose is sometimes just strictly not allowed in a dungeon space. Sometimes they'll want to, have they have a certain area for it, and they want, certain kind of protection because, as Josie said, you don't have to be fluid bonded. We're all risk aware. We know, what happens when you start mixing blood or ingesting blood or something like that. But there is a safety factor here that we would be remiss if we didn't bring up. So, does anybody have a few words about playing with blood and the hazards of it?
Well, I think...
Go ahead.
Nope,
so I think that anybody who says that they have... My biggest thing with this is that there are hazards inherent with this that put you at elevated risk. Absolutely. That is true. Because you are dealing with somebody's fluids and you don't know if someone has a bloodborne pathogen. You should be taking the same precautions. Whether you know someone has something or not, it doesn't matter. It's the same as a doctor's office. Whether you have a bloodborne pathogen or not, they're still going to wear gloves. They're still going to, take the same precautions, which I think you always should. My biggest thing about this sort of thing is that we're not doing a surgery. So one of my biggest red flags with people who top, sharp, pointy things is them saying that they sterilize their things. They're very sterile. This is a sterile environment. That's not true. This is not an operating room. Sterile is a myth. Once you open up that needle that's been sealed from the medical company and it's exposed to the air, you are no longer sterile. You are sanitized, you are disinfected, but you're not sterile. And that also is one of the reasons why there's an elevated risk. You have an open wound. But you all are talking about a shallow, even a cutting is pretty shallow. You're not talking about the level of risk that a lot of people make it seem like. Unless you cut that person and throw them down in the dirt, as long as you're taking a reasonable, even your mouth doesn't really present that big of an issue with regard to germs on shallow areas like this. That's kind of my 2 cents.
Okay, so the safety patrol is a little overactive on this, but
yeah, they just make it a little stupid sometimes.
But there are risks inherent in this, and certainly you wouldn't want to, it's just like dungeon furniture. If you sweat on it, we want it wiped off. Okay, it's common courtesy, and it's just a nice thing to be on something clean. Bleeding on a piece of furniture is a little bit different, and that requires a little bit of extra care to clean up. Not just because of the risk of these, bloodborne pathogens, but for people's comfort.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the space. So, all right, I didn't want to get too far into that. I did realize as we were talking about this a while back, or a little bit earlier in the show, when Josie was talking about, being close, and Shane, you being so far away when you're using your single tail. it's one of the things that I like about it that I didn't realize until now is that, first of all, it can be quiet. With a lot of impact scenes, there's a lot of noise. This can be quiet. This can be, you are very close to each other usually if you're using, scalpels, needles, or knives. But, in private you can do that. But it's also not as much of a workout for me, and I'm a little bit lazy. So, I can flog the crap out of you for a half an hour and then have to go hit an inhaler and sit down for a rest, or I can sit down and share a really intimate moment with somebody that doesn't wear me the fuck out. That's what I'm saying. It's kind of nice to have a calm and connective scene rather than a frantic calisthenic workout. It could be a nice change of pace anyways.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's really nice.
So can we get into some of the technical stuff then?
Be my guest.
Well, it's interesting because we talk about this, and the one thing I notice is that a lot of times invariably we get into a lot of the woo of this about why we do it. But one of the things that we don't talk about, and I think it's especially important with this topic, when you're talking about needles especially, I get asked a lot of the same questions, which are, where do you get your needles? Like, where do you get supplies for this? What do I need to do this in a way that makes me feel safe? Again, to Josie's point, I'm not a surgeon. The 3,500 square foot, I think it was swept last week, warehouse that we do this in is not, a surgical theater. And so, people have some very general questions about what, where can you get this stuff, and what do you need? What do you need to make your own little sharps kit? Yeah. And I think that those are important things to talk about if we're going to talk about play stuff.
Well, disposal is something that you really need to think about before you're.
That's the first thing you need to think about.
Right. Before you stick a needle into somebody, you should think about what you're going to do with it when you pull it back out. So sharps containers are widely available. I mean, you can pick them up at Walgreens. They're very cheap, but disposing of them can be tricky. So where can you dispose of a sharps container? First of all, a sharps container, let's explain that. That is basically a red box with biohazard signs on it, with a special way of putting stuff in where it can't come out. So it's meant to go in there and go in there permanently. Thank you, Shane.
This is what a sharps container looks like. It has a hole for scalpels and needles. And yes, she's got one in the background that I've been staring at the whole time. She's been talking as well.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a sharps container, and you always want to have one. They come in various sizes. You don't need the hospital size one that you bolt to a wall. But this is nice because I can put staples, needles, and if I had scalpel blades in there as well.
Mm-hmm. So where do you get needles and scalpels and knives that are suitable for cutting, for instance?
Well, you can get a lot of that stuff online. One of the great places is kinkymedical.net. They sell a lot of that stuff online. Now, you have to check because I'm not exactly sure in various jurisdictions, various states, what their rules are. I've never had a problem with it, but I've heard some states have issues that you have to be licensed to order some of this stuff. I don't know. But here in Kentucky, we've never had a problem. But also here in Kentucky, if you go to Rural King or Tractor Supply, they sell a lot of the animal syringes, which are exactly the same. And you can get them in large packs. They use them for inoculating farm animals and stuff. But they're the exact same needles. What's that?
And probably cheaper, right?
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because generally you buy them in smaller batches, and so the smaller the batch you buy them, and usually the more expensive they are in terms of cost per unit. When we buy needles, what's that?
Usually Tractor Supply is a little bit cheaper on those, but by the time you drive to the most local one, you've already spent.
Yeah. But it's easy to go and get them. They come in various sizes for people who are unfamiliar. The larger the number, the gauge, the smaller the needle. Or sorry, the larger the needle. No, the smaller the needle. So if you got a 22 gauge needle, it's a very, very thin needle versus, say, an 18 gauge, which is a much thicker needle. And so the size of the needle...
Go ahead.
Yep. I was just going to say the size of the needle obviously is going to make an impact on the kind of sensation that it's going to go. A lot of people will start with much smaller needles, much thinner needles because they're easier to manipulate. they are good for people who've never done it before because the sensation is much less compared to some of the larger gauge needles.
They're also color coded, so all 22s are the same color. 25s are gray, 22s are blue. So if you're going to do something pretty, that's a good thing to keep in mind. I personally shop local because I like to shop local. We have a local medical supply store, and they're the kind of medical supply store that you can go and buy like diabetic supplies and any kind of medical supply that you can think of. Honestly, they have it there, and a lot of home health people use them. So they just have a ton of machines and everything like that. But they also carry needles because that's something that you carry for. What was that?
Is that Gould's?
We have Gould's here. I don't know.
Grogan's. We have where I live.
Okay, I just want to know because I don't think I've ever seen needles in a Gould's. I was just curious.
Yeah, so and you buy them by the box. They come in a pretty large box, so you kind of have to commit. They're not terribly expensive, but you do get a box of I think 100, depending on which size that you get. But they're not super expensive, so I think personally it's worth it. And they're individually packaged when you get them, so each needle comes in its own. I have them over there. I can get them if you want to see them, but they're kind of individually packaged within plastic and then within a plastic tube. So there's kind of 2 layers of protection that you have, and then they have a little head on the end that you hold them by. But yeah, so I like to shop local for a couple of reasons. One of them is that when you're just getting started and you're kind of confused about what you're looking for, the medical supply people don't know why I'm looking for them, and they've never asked me why, but they're really great about giving me information. They were really nice about like helping me out. I think they kind of assume that you're diabetic or you're a nurse or something like that, and so they were really helpful to me. At least they let me look at the product before I bought it, and I really liked that about them. They also had cheap boxes of gauze, drop cloths. You can buy sharps containers there. They were the first ones who told me that I could take my sharps containers to drugstores, to the pharmacist to dispose of them, which I didn't know that you could do. No questions asked. They don't ask you. They just assume you're a diabetic. So
that is an answer to a good question that I had before. Once it's full, what do you do with it? Take it to the drugstore, and they will get rid of it for you. I found that, because there are a lot of actual medical wholesalers online, you're going to have a hard time finding scalpels at some of the, sort of diabetic supply places. There are very few reasons why people would need scalpels at home. Scalpels, scalpels seem to find me, so it's cool. People like, hey, I got 10 of these. You want them? Fuck yes, I do. Disposable ones. People who work in hospitals or whatever, they're just like, here, I took these home and have
I get
them.
bags of stuff from phlebotomists. Like I have phlebotomist friends who are like, oh, I have literally a bag of Lurlock needles. Would you like them? Yeah,
So
sure.
rule number 1 of getting into blood play: get a phlebotomist friend.
Yeah, no medical people.
So, but you can't. There are plenty of other sources, and there are actually kinky vendors online that you can order scalpels from.
but if you even Google disposable scalpels, you get like 80 websites that you can buy them from. Your
Right.
paranoia is like your worst enemy with medical stuff. Like nobody suspects that you're gonna go home and cut up your girlfriend. Like just get it out of your head, because that's not what they think. They think that you're a medical professional. Like they don't care. Is the point.
And I have ordered online, and the sharps show up, and nobody cares. The feds or the Women in Protection Services do not knock on the door 5 minutes after you sign for the package. That does not happen.
There are no sting operations with medical.
No, absolutely.
supplies.
This is a completely legitimate business transaction.
Right. What about protective gear? We talked about disposal, but what about gloves, masks, visors?
Harbor Freight, $7 for 100 of them.
100 of what?
These are rubber. These are nitrile gloves. Always good to have nitrile because latex allergies will be the bane of your existence.
Mm-hmm.
So, because, I'm not saying I go through gloves, but I maybe go through some gloves.
Again, not sterile, but
I was going to add that too. Those are not sterile. So back to Josie's point.
Right, but they are designed to prevent blood contamination from person to person.
Right, and that's another thing that I should probably add. When people are talking about using gloves when they play, a lot of times people are under the impression that wearing gloves when you're doing needles is for the protection of the top. so that
Yes.
your blood that I am getting out of you doesn't get into me. Well, yes, that's true. But my filthy ass hands near your wounds is also not a good idea. So it kind of goes both ways there. It is also there for the bottom's protection. So yeah, maybe not sterile, but clean. You
gotta be realistic
certainly
about it.
cleaner than my fingernails.
I'm a nail biter, right?
Yeah.
So I sometimes have these little, micro little cuts and stuff around my fingers from being a nail biter. So it's just in everybody's best interest to have a barrier between that. Period.
Yeah, and your hands are filthy. Everybody's hands are filthy. So
They
keep
also
that
come
in
in
mind.
sizes. That's probably good to mention.
Yeah.
Gloves come in sizes. I have extremely tiny hands.
I order the
So if
Magnum.
what?
I order the Magnums.
You have gigantic man hands. I have extremely tiny hands, so if I were to try to do needles wearing like giant, large gloves, I wouldn't be able to. I would be looking a hot mess because I couldn't grip anything, and I can't get my fingers like up into it. It actually ends up making everybody less safe because I'm fucking with my glove more than I'm paying attention to yourself. So.
Mm-hmm. What about some of those masks and, sort of like the visors and stuff? I mean, I had somebody insist to me, I guess they were into flesh hooking and stuff like that, and they always wore one of those visors, that like they wear in the OR when they're doing open heart surgery. If there's like they cut something and they get a splurt of blood in the face or something like that. Does anybody play with those? Because I never buggered with them.
No, I've never bothered.
Yeah.
Well, that's when you come back to rack, and if you're risk aware and you know that what you're doing, you're not going to hit a squirter, like that is not going to spray you in the face, or if he were cutting me and my blood were to get on his face, like, again, we're already fluid bonded, he doesn't need to worry.
Or maybe it's just one of those precautions, because you know how hard it is once you have the gloves on to stop touching all the filthy shit. Your phone rings and you're like, oh crap, I can't touch it, and then you're like doing this, and try not to touch your face for a little while and see how hard that is. I don't know, maybe some people have that just as like not a good idea. I think they're unnecessary for the kinds of stuff that we generally do in blood play and in the kink community, but
although I will say, for the shits and giggles of it, and you cannot discount that, our play space, for example, has medical tables in it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have an old literal green surgical scrub gown that I got at a Goodwill that had a big batch of medical supplies come in. So when you roll the sleeves down and then roll the gloves over that and put the mask on, it takes on a whole different feel when you're doing like a medical play scene with blood than just, me in jeans and a t-shirt.
Right.
That's
so
a good way to
scare
introduce
the
fear.
shit out of them. Yes.
Oh, you thought you were getting a flower? No, bitch, we're doing surgery.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
and
what
then
we have our staplers.
Yeah. So I don't know, what are some other good things to have? Antiseptic wipes are good.
Alcohol wipes.
Alcohol, there are other, whether you get into iodine or whether you get into some of the other fancier chemicals that some of the hospitals use, if you can source some of those things, if you feel
Which
like
you do want to be careful for allergies as well. Latex allergies are one, iodine allergies are the other. Most people don't know they have them, is the reason why you always want to bring it up and make sure, because that's a bad way to figure out someone has an allergy.
But you do want to clean a wound with alcohol, is that right?
No.
Yes.
No.
peroxide.
I think so, for added fun, for science.
And then have a cleanup plan. So how are you going to treat it when it's done? Are you looking to leave a mark? Are you looking to leave a scar? There are things like alcohol, for instance, that you could put in there, peroxide, cigar ashes, whatever it is that you're using to make the scar stay. That's but you don't want to get stuck, done with your scene, going, oh, what do I, oh my God, they're bleeding. You have any gauze? Anybody? And then, Band-Aids. I need lots of Band-Aids. Have that plan in place before you start doing any of this.
We have a full kit. I'm pulling stuff out of my kit here, but we have all of that stuff, from alcohol wipes to spray bottles of alcohol.
Yeah.
Always handy and fun.
Mm-hmm. And painful.
Peroxide, if people don't know, is amazing for cleaning up blood, especially dry blood. So spraying peroxide, it bubbles, and you just wipe it off, and it's gone. If you try doing alcohol, it just kind of smears it around. Peroxide actually picks it up, which is nice. I've got all my gloves in there. I've got ribbon, as they said, for doing kind of more decorative and fancy stuff. We've got the medical staple remover. If you buy a medical stapler, buy the remover.
Yeah.
Good safety note there. Good tip, Egon, for those of you that remember that quote. What else do we have? Cotton pads. We also have like Lysol wipes for cleaning up after. Not, don't use them on people, but they're good for cleaning up furniture and all that kind of stuff afterwards. So we try to keep everything we need except for a tarp, or we actually use a drop cloth, which is a tarp on one side and muslin on the other, so it's a little more comfortable to lay on, but it's still non-porous, so stuff doesn't get through onto the floors or wherever your space is that you are.
Mm-hmm. All right, good stuff. Thank you, panel. We're going to end this episode right here. Tune in a couple weeks from now. We'll have a whole couple of other topics for you. Same time, same place, 2 weeks from tonight. So thank you, everybody. We'll stop it here.
Bye, everybody.